Welcome to my podcast. My name is Victor Vogel. People take communication for granted. We often don't think about what we say to others. And many times, barriers get in the way of communicating with others. On this podcast, we're going to look at current events through communication. If you'd like to discuss how communication or the lack of communications impacted you, please contact me through my website at www.victorvogel.com. Thanks for joining me. I hope your day has been great. I've looked at my calendar and my phone and everything today, and if there's anything like an information overload arena, it's happening out there today. But that's communication, and you just have to deal with it when the time comes. But anyway, thanks for joining me. In this episode, I want to cover nonverbal communication. However, I don't want to cover all aspects of nonverbal communication in detail because it's one of the most researched and documented forms of communication. And it'd take forever. There have been thousands of books published on the subjects and tens of thousands of journal articles, and that doesn't include visual media, training programs, news stories, and all the other stuff. Much of the documentation is debatable, and frankly, some is even suspicious. However, nonverbal communication is a powerful form of communication and deserves your attention. Perhaps more problems in communication can be attributed to the lack of nonverbal communication being available during interpersonal communication than any other issue. These are the primary branches of nonverbal communication. Proxemics. And this is the branch of knowledge that deals with the space people feel necessary to set between themselves and others. Some have defined these spaces into three categories. The first category is intimate distance, and that's when someone touches you and then reaches out to about 18 inches from you. Personal space is 16 inches to 4 feet. Social distance is between 4 feet and 12 feet, and public spread is greater than 12 feet. Intimate distances are for family, close friends, lovers, and those who you want to tell your deepest secrets to. Personal distance is usually restricted to friends or work associates and people you're familiar with, but you really don't consider them intimate. Social space accommodates business affairs or unfamiliar gatherings like the lobby of a theater. The public spread refers to events like a concert and is the distance between a talent and the crowd. And another example is the distance between football players and fans in a stadium. Proxemics accommodates a large variety of nonverbal communication. It impacts everybody's communication in one way or the other. Kinesics is the study of how specific body movements and gestures serve as nonverbal communication. It involves gestures, postures, facial expressions, and eye contact. When people discuss nonverbal communication, kinesics is what most people mention first. There are tons of books authored about how kinesics can be used to discover when people tell a lie. Interrogators use kinesics when interviewing a prisoner, and psychologists use it to validate patients' verbal responses. Paralanguage is the third form of nonverbal communication. It involves your voice, but not spoken words. It could be your tone, it could be an inflection or intensity and loudness. Vocalics involve fillers while talking. For example, or you know, or similar phrases that consume time and often denote a lack of credibility or confidence, but not always. Most of us do this at some point in time anyway. Eliminating fillers is one way to improve your image, though, while communicating. Chronemics relates to time. Like, are you late to a business meeting in a formal environment? Where, in a social climate, arriving late to a private party is seen as socially acceptable. Chronemics also refers to the quality of time spent together while communicating, which denotes where you're communicating. Research also shows people who talk slightly longer when speaking are more credible than those who talk too much or too little. I think what will help you are some examples of these forms of nonverbal communication. And fortunately, there's a lady by the name of Kimberly Collins who back in 2008 did a brief video using the television series Friends, and she cut some clips out demonstrating nonverbal communication for a few of these areas we've talked about. So I'll show you this, but I'll also put a link to the video in the description to view it several times if you'd like, because I reviewed it several times and I picked up on several things going over it 2 or 3 times. So I recommend you do that. The nonverbal video is actually one of only 2 she posted, so fortunately it's still there and available to us, and you can watch this video, and then I will be back at the end of the video and we'll talk a little more about communication.
I'm pregnant. And you're the father, by the way, but you got it.
Your job's a joke, you broke. Your love life's the away.
No, I could get him to forgive us.
I don't know.
I'm telling you. I can do it.
Yeah, he can do it.
It's like you're always stuck in second gear.
He was like this crazy-eyed, hairy beast man. He was like a Bigfoot or a Yeti or something. Hi, just so you know, we didn't mean to fog you. We actually thought you were like a Yeti or something. Hi.
So you like the short hair better?
What? Yeti? I'm Danny?
When it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, or even your year. But
Phoebes? Hello?
I'll be there for you. When the rain starts to fall, I'll be there for you. Like I've been there before. I'll be there for you.
If you two are happy, then I'm happy for you. I'm fine.
Really?
Absolutely. I'm fine. Totally fine. I don't know why it's coming out all loud and squeaky, because really, I'm fine.
Things are going great.
hide the fact that you accidentally picked up my grandmother's ring and you accidentally proposed to Rachel.
When people do this, I don't really know what that means. I'm sorry.
When it hasn't been your day, your week, your month, even your year, I'll be there for you. When the rain starts to fall, I'll be there for you. Like I've been there before, I'll be there for you. 'Cause you're there for me too. I'll be there for you. I'll be there for you. I'll be there for you. 'Cause you're there for me too.
I hope you found the video both enlightening and enjoyable. Actors are aware of all the nonverbal communication areas. They learn to use them to accentuate a scene or enhance meaning during a particular moment in the film. They often exaggerate nonverbal cues to make their points. I want to emphasize the importance nonverbal communication plays when delivering a message during interpersonal communication processes. Also, I want you to understand what happens when some or all of nonverbal communication processes are missing during a conversation. To do this, I will use the communication model I've used to teach interpersonal communication. You can review this model in depth on my website. View the Part 1 video podcast about interpersonal communication. It's under the home page. I will only discuss how nonverbal communication impacts this model and how you can learn to improve your communication and persuasion by enhancing nonverbal communication as much as possible. Of course, there will be times when you can't use some of the nonverbal tools due to barriers that are outside of your control, like geographic distancing. But with today's technology, there are means to overcome times when nonverbal communication is restricted. You can also enhance parts of the communication model to compensate for the lack of nonverbal communication. So let's briefly review the model for just a moment to ascertain when nonverbal communication will be highly effective in getting your message heard and understood correctly. Nonverbal communication is most effective at the point of delivery and during feedback. Most conversations are circular, where you send a message and receive feedback. The received feedback will often dictate what the following statement will be and how nonverbal communication might change because of the feedback. For example, if you were on the telephone, the sender might say, "We have a bad connection. I can hardly hear you." You then would want to fix that situation before proceeding further. Now, the biggest threat to positive use of nonverbal communication is eliminating nonverbal messaging from the message system or minimizing aspects of nonverbal behavior. Eliminating nonverbal communication frequently happens today when people use social media to communicate. Both internal barriers and external barriers can negatively impact nonverbal communication. Let's address the most prominent and frequent external obstacles. The first is the method you use to start the communication process. Sometimes you don't have a choice. For example, if the person you are going to communicate with lives out of the country in a different time zone, you might have to use a telephone, or more likely today, a smartphone like an iPhone. iPhone calls destroy haptics. In other words, you can't touch, you can't feel, you can't be close in proximity to the individual you're talking to. It hinders kinesics because eye contact and facial movements are not available on a simple voice call. It often impacts chronemics because you may feel pressure to reduce the time for communication and diminish the quality of the communication. Reducing the quality of communication can reduce your credibility and your persuasiveness. A Zoom conference call brings into play some of the critical factors, just not as effective as being face-to-face. When you use the technology, you place yourself at the mercy of technology. You can become dependent on your connection, the cost of the time, bandwidth issues. When you use social media, you eliminate a vast majority of the critical factors of nonverbal communication. You have no proximity to help connect you to the receiver. Kinesics, which are face and eye movements and gestures, are basically non-existent. Chronemics comes into play because your time to be viewed is competitive with thousands of other tweets or posts, each only having seconds to be noticed. The closest you come is using curse words to emote feelings. Emojis are supposed to denote a sense of feeling, but do you feel the other person's feelings from an emoji as if they were there? Really? Selecting the most effective means for sending your message that maximizes both congruent verbal and nonverbal communication is the optimal way for the recipient to intake your message with the intended meaning. If you are the receiver of a message void of nonverbal communication, you should try to adjust the communication to enhance any nonverbal communications you can adapt. For example, you might respond by saying to the sender, "Before we get started, I'd like to call you back on a Zoom call so I can give you my best attention." If you cannot change the message transmission, you should do your best to validate everything said using active listening. You also need to validate a message if you receive feedback from the receiver to a message you sent. Active listening is necessary to check for understanding intent in a message. You can learn more about active listening from a previous podcast I had on active listening. Reciting back what a person says and stating any emotions or feelings you received from the person's message is an excellent way to determine if you understand what they're saying and what they meant. Learning how to communicate interpersonally is one of the best ways to establish credibility and influence. A vast majority of why people communicate is to influence someone else. Ask them to do something, change their behavior, correct a problem, or keep them from making mistakes. Of course, you can think of many more reasons, I'm sure. When it comes to people connecting, nothing happens until we communicate. The most significant factor when communicating is your credibility as a message sender. One way to establish credibility is to ensure your verbal communication is consistent with your nonverbal communication. while sending a message. Syncing your nonverbal signals with your verbal message creates a feeling of trust between you and the receiver of your message. Research shows believability of a message is impacted more by nonverbal congruency with the verbal message than just the words in a verbal signal. The contribution nonverbal communication makes to credibility is explained in a book called Communication in the Real World. It's an introduction to communication studies, and it's found in the University of Minnesota library. And I want to quote what it says about this. Quote, although we can rely on verbal communication to fill in the blanks, sometimes left by nonverbal expressions, we often put more trust into what people do over what they say. This is especially true in times of stress or danger, when our behaviors become more instinctual and we rely on older systems of thinking and acting that evolved before our ability to speak and write. And it's research done by Anderson in 1999. This innateness creates intuitive feelings about the genuineness of nonverbal communication, and this genuineness relates back to our earlier discussion about the times involuntary and often subconscious nature of nonverbal communication. An example of the innateness of nonverbal signals can be found in children who have been blind since birth, but still exhibit the facial expressions as other children. In short, the involuntary or subconscious nature of nonverbal communication makes it less easy to fake, which makes it seem more honest and credible. Close quote. Okay, now that we know what nonverbal communication is, we know the critical areas within nonverbal communication, how to use it in the interpersonal communication process, and how it lends itself to your credibility while communicating. Let's look at some tips for using nonverbal communication effectively. Try moving around during lectures and discussions. It reduces physical distance, and you kind of have to determine what the proper space is for that type of situation. But the closer you can get in proximity to someone, the more intimate your relationship and more personal your relationship will be, and likely the more influential you will be. Keep the line of sight open between the sender's body and the receiver by avoiding sitting behind a desk while directly interfacing with your audience, or turning your back on an audience while talking, or constantly interrupting, or texting on your phone. These are just a few things I notice while watching. I tend to watch people when I go out to eat, or I happen to sit down to have a drink or something. A lot of times I will sit by myself and simply watch people and watch how they interact. And that's how I learn to execute these factors more effectively on an ongoing basis. And I never stop doing that, and I never stop learning. Being expressive and animated with facial expressions, gestures, and voice, it demonstrates enthusiasm. Like, smiling creates a positive and open climate. Making frequent eye contact with people communicates attentiveness and interest. Calling people by name reduces perceived psychological distance. That is so beneficial. Making appropriate self-disclosures to others about personal thoughts, feelings, or experiences reduces perceived psychological distance, and it creates an open climate. And it encourages reciprocation. It's something I discussed in a previous podcast. You really need to listen to that. When creating your message, make sure you think about your audience and the proper use of nonverbal cues based on the situation. Remember to decrease distance in stages slowly. Keep in mind your power base with your audience. For example, if you're the boss and you have subordinates, especially when touching, haptics and feelings are involved. Haptics are touching and feeling. Sending the wrong nonverbal message can shut down communication instantly and can make people turn cold quickly. Now, for a few takeaways from this podcast. Nonverbal communication is critical to delivering your message persuasively and impactfully. Nonverbal communication must be congruent with your verbal communication. It enhances both the sender's transmission and the receiver's feedback. Keep in mind all of the critical factors of nonverbal communication when encoding your message and when sending it so that you have your maximum impact. Use active listening when it comes to verbal and nonverbal communication to interpret feedback from the sender accurately. Your communication establishes your credibility. Nonverbal cues play an essential role in creating your credibility. Try to eliminate those filters. Can't always do it, but the uhs and the ums and the you knows and other filters when communicating. If this is one of your problems, take some time to work on this issue. I still work on this on a regular basis because they still slip in with me even during presentations like this. If you can't meet in person face-to-face and often, we can't. Eliminate as many barriers as possible. For example, do short Zoom meetings instead of a phone call, especially for really critical discussions that are important to you. Don't use the social media as a primary means for persuasion. The Pew Research Institute found around 75% of people using social media will not change their minds based on social media. You got to know that over 70% of your message, the nonverbal part, is missing when you use social media. Your credibility does not come from likes. Bots can create thousands of likes and followers, and bots are not people, and bots don't recognize credibility. Okay? So, thanks for watching and listening to this podcast. Your helpful comments are really appreciated. Links to resources are in the descriptions. Any donations you feel comfortable making are greatly appreciated and offset my time and costs for the podcast. There's a link in the description where you can contribute directly to PayPal without signing up for PayPal. My opinions are my own, and they don't represent anyone else or any entity's opinions. Until next time, remember, nonverbal communication can enhance your credibility with others.